Greetings and salutations, nerds. This is Praying for Superpowers, a show about the deeper meanings, messages, and intricacies hidden within nerd culture. I'm Trever Shirin, and today I'm talking about the imposter syndrome and Aragorn. Alright, so today I'm not planning on going into depth on the history of Aragorn as a character. I'm more interested in kind of examining his story from the lens of a counselor. As many of you know, I am currently in my master's degree for clinical mental health, and so the way that I see everything in life right now is through the lens of emotions and thoughts and behaviors and how all of these things intersect with each other. And I was recently reading through The Two Towers again, and I came to a point right after Gandalf the Grey is no more, and Aragorn has taken over the Fellowship, which has fallen apart. And Aragorn is talking to Legolas, I believe, where he says, I don't know how I'm supposed to lead Gondor and the realm of men when I can't even seem to make a good decision with the Fellowship. Of course, that's a paraphrase. He says it much more eloquently than I can. But this was really interesting to me because he's communicating this idea that ever since Gandalf the Grey, the rightful leader of the Fellowship, has gone away, he was consequently put in charge of the Fellowship. He was the next best person to lead. And as soon as he takes over leadership, it feels like everything falls apart. He loses the ring bearer. He loses two of the other hobbits. And there's this wild chase that he goes on. And then once the wild chase happens, he comes back to Rohan, somewhere where he spent a lot of time as a child, and sees it fallen to ruin under the king. I think oftentimes when we read through books, we don't think about the human aspect of the characters we're reading about. And that's really easy to do in fantasy novels. I also think that we've noticed this sort of trend within fantasy novels that leans towards examining the human story within a fantasy setting, which I think is really beautiful. Tolkien set out to create a fantasy world, and from there were stories that happened consequentially. This got me thinking about why wasn't Aragorn just made the King of Gondor? Why wasn't he in Gondor? So I did some digging and found out that Aragorn is an orphan. He was given into the care of Elrond and the people of Rivendell, and he wasn't even told who he was until about the age of 29. So then at the age of 29, he's told who he is and the destiny that's laid out before him, and he's given the Ring of Barahir. What's interesting is that there's a lot of pressure from Elrond on here's what you're supposed to do in order to be a king, and he's grown up hearing the tales of the Silmarillion. He's grown up hearing about the great exploits of kings. He's heard about not only the great failures of Isildur, but the great successes as well. And so for him to discover at the age of 29 that he is supposed to be the ruler of men, and that one day the entire existence of mankind will be dependent upon him, I can imagine as an extraordinary pressure on him. I should note at this point that we had a friend of ours, Cameron Kozlarek, come in and talk about his knowledge of The Lord of the Rings. And he brought up some really interesting things that I think are worth talking about here.
Isildur ruled over Gondor and his brother over Arnor. Eventually, as the kingdoms of man declined, Arnor became more. They kept losing more and more cities. Minas, I forget what it was called, but eventually one of their cities was taken and became Minas Morgul. Osgiliath fell into decline, and the last king at the time was challenged to to single combat by the Witch King of Angmar. And he was actually warned by Glorfindel, the High Captain of Rivendell, and Elrond's right hand, that he should not fight him, that and that's where the prophecy of no man can kill the Witch King. I foresee that someday he will be brought down by someone else, is where that came from. And he waited for a while, but a few years later, after Angmar was defeated, he was challenged again. And this time, the High King of Gondor rode into Minas Morgul and never returned. And thus began the line of Gondor being ruled over by the stewards for hundreds of years. But there still remained one house of like uncles. They were the cousins. I believe they were indirect descendants of Isildur's younger brother. And they lived in Arnor at the time, and that city had fallen so much that there were only a few villages of what later on became the Rangers. And later on, Arathorn's father was killed by a cave troll, and their village that they lived in was attacked and destroyed by orcs, and Elladan and Elrohir, Elrond's sons, managed to smuggle Aragorn and his mother into safety in Rivendell, which is why he was raised there by Elrond. I believe he is a descendant of Isildur. I do not believe he is a direct descendant of the eldest son of kings. So he is like Isildur had 3 sons, and the youngest one was the only one who survived after the Battle of Gladden Fields. And so each son had more sons, and so he is. I believe he is a. I know that contradicts what I say.
So would it be inappropriate to say that Aragorn is essentially the leftovers of the Numenor?
Essentially, yeah, he is the only one left of the noble house of the Numenor. There are still other remnants of the Dunedain, but of the noble house of the Numenor, he is the only one left.
There's an interesting concept called the imposter syndrome, and some of us may be familiar with it whether we know the title or not. The imposter syndrome is when you are put into a position of either leadership or a skill or a craft, and you feel like you are not qualified to do that thing. This is actually really common with counselors in my stage of the process of learning and education, where we sit with somebody and we're listening to them and we're implementing some skills that we've gained throughout the years, but it still feels like we have no right to be in that room helping somebody. It still feels like we aren't supposed to be doing this because who put us in charge? It's similar to, I think there's this running joke of at least my generation of who decided that we were allowed to be adults. And then being adults and being parents and thinking like, oh, okay, well, I'm not qualified for this. I always thought that parents and adults had so much more skill than I had, so much more training and knew what they were doing. But turns out nobody did. So this imposter syndrome is really common. The thought was, if Aragorn feels this imposter syndrome, if he feels like I'm not qualified, I shouldn't be doing this, and I've spent the last few decades before meeting the Fellowship alone, seeing all of the bad that this world has to offer. I think it's really interesting to see the path that Aragorn takes from the imposter syndrome, from this 29-year-old kid who is told that the entire existence of mankind is going to depend on you one day, and you are supposed to be the king of Gondor. From that moment to when he's in his 60s, and he finally accepts the mantle of king, there's this interesting humility and I don't even think it's entirely humility. I think some of it is this imposter syndrome when Aragorn refuses to take the mantle of king, or refuses to even enter Minas Tirith after the Battle of Pelennor Fields because Sauron hasn't been defeated. Some of it, yes, is absolutely humility. I think that Aragorn is this very virtuous and very kind and very brave man. I also think that there's a part of him that is wondering, can I actually be king if this task isn't done, if I haven't proven myself as king? One moment that I think really defines the change in Aragorn's story is when he goes into the paths of the dead and he reaches the dead men of Dunharrow. It's at this moment when Aragorn claims his birthright and says, essentially, I am Isildur's heir, and you must follow through with the oath that was broken. This is a moment of, I think, challenge and trust for Aragorn, because on the one hand, if they say no, it reinforces some of the thoughts he may have. If they say yes, then it seems to be a confirmation that this is truly who he is and what he is meant to do. In order to sit with either of these options, Aragorn has to take a leap of faith. He has to take a leap of faith into himself and who he knows himself to be, to trust that either option will be okay. The counselor in me really comes out at this moment, because I think there are so many opportunities in our lives where we feel like an imposter, and we've maybe had people telling us this is who you are, good or bad, but I want to focus on the good. People encouraging us, this is who you are this kind of person, and you are meant for this sort of thing. It takes a lot of trust to live in that way, according to what we've been told about ourselves. For Aragorn, I would suspect that it probably took 30 years for him to come to a point where he felt confident. I am the king, and I am the right person to be the king. For us, we may not be the king of mankind, obviously. Nobody is. But I think that there are other things in our lives that we feel the imposter syndrome with. And it feels like we keep making mistake after mistake after mistake. And who put us in charge? Who decided that it would be a good thing for us to be in this position? When we look at the life of Aragorn and this struggle he experiences, at least from my perception through the Fellowship of the Rings and before, I think it's really interesting to think about how it can apply to our lives. A couple key things that I think are really important that we can adapt into our own stories is that Aragorn has people around him who are speaking truth into him. We see throughout The Lord of the Rings that at least Legolas and Gimli are around him speaking truth about his identity. Legolas is one of the first to stand up in the movies and say, do you know who this person is? This is Isildur's heir. We also see that Aragorn has Gandalf advising him and encouraging him and providing space for him to be king. I think if we surround ourselves with people who are encouraging us towards our identity and encouraging us towards the destiny that's before us. Now, these are big words, but what this might look like is if you are a parent, having people surround you who say you are a good parent, you are a good dad or a good mom. If this is a new job, having people around you who are able to encourage you, you do this work very well, and you are specifically gifted for this area. For a lot of us, it may not feel like we have people around us who are able to do that, and that can be so hard. My encouragement for you is to seek those people out, to engage with them when there is opportunity. The other thing that I think is important to take from the story of Aragorn is a leap of faith, a moment where he sets aside his feelings of an imposter, and he says, if this is what I truly am, then I'm going to take a few steps in that and trust that this is true. I think that ultimately there's a long journey for a lot of us to reach our destiny or to reach the thing that we're pursuing. I know that's true for me. I've spent the past 2 years working towards a degree in clinical mental health. And even though there is maybe a light at the end of the tunnel for me in a few months of graduation, it still has been a long journey, and there's a long journey ahead of me. And every moment I need to have people reminding me and remind myself that it's okay for me to feel like I'm struggling. And it is also okay for me to act like a therapist. It is okay for me to adopt that title and to act as though it is true. And one day I truly do believe that if we step forward in that way, we will truly sit comfortably in that title. So I'll be examining a couple more of the characters as we go ahead, but I think that I want to place the challenge to all of you to think about these stories in a different way. and think about how we might be able to gather some encouragement from them and to learn a little bit from Aragorn and the rest of the Fellowship. So until the next one, I'll see you around.